Ladies and gentlemen, another video on the Beatles! It's been said time and time again, nearly to the point of exhaustion, but still after more than half a century, the Beatles continue to be the singular most influential musical group in pretty much all of music industry history. And we've heard it all before, how the Beatles went from being just this sort of boy band to an experimental rock group in a span of less than 6 years. How the Beatles revolutionized the recording studio experience. How with the Beatles, we really start to see the first modern, fully formed version of a fandom created by Beatlemaniacs and Apple Scruffs, as they were affectionately referred to as. But at times, it can be a little difficult for a modern audience to understand just how much the Beatles shaped culture, how much they changed it. I mean, these guys were masters of the cultural zeitgeist. In fact, the Beatles have been so interwoven into our culture that it might be difficult at times to even notice when the Beatles are referenced or when something comes from a Beatles song or from the Beatles themselves. So today I want to talk to you about this, and I want to share ways that the Beatles either directly or indirectly influence different parts of our culture, from, of course, music to movies and TV to science as well as tech. And I honestly think that you guys are going to be surprised, and I think even for some really hardcore Beatlemaniacs, you're going to be surprised by some references that you may have actually missed. Let's start with something close to home for the four lads from Liverpool, and we're going to jump right into talking about music. Now, if we're going to talk about musicians and artists who reference the Beatles all the time, who are huge fans of the Beatles, who have talked about the Beatles' influence, who claim to be the reincarnation of John Lennon, what was that last part? Are we just going to make this whole section about Oasis? No, but for real, if there's one band or artist or whatever that is pretty much more well known for who they're influenced by, other than their own discography, it's gotta be Oasis. The Manchester born and bred band has never shied away from talking about how the Beatles really influenced them, about how they were the reason for them making music, about how Liam Gallagher thinks that he was the reincarnation of John Lennon. It's especially evident in their songwriting how influenced by the Beatles Oasis was. In fact, I'm going to name a few songs that contain lyrics that directly mention the Beatles. We have Supersonic, we have Morning Glory, we have Fade In Out, we have Be Here Now, we have She's Electric, and we have Do You Know What I Mean? All those songs I just listed contain lyrics from Beatles songs, and they are pretty obvious. Like in the song Supersonic, we have the lyric Sail With Me in My Yellow Submarine. In the song Fadin' Out, we have Get On the Helter Skelter. In the song You Know What I Mean, we have lyrical references to The Fool on the Hill and I Feel Fine, pretty much saying The Fool on the Hill and I Feel Fine. It's not even a secret. They don't try to hide this at all. What's nice about this to me is that it just must be the ultimate fan moment to be able to reach a certain level of popularity where you can put references about your favorite artists into your own music and then sing these songs to an audience, share your joy with the world and have them sing it back to you. It just must be such a cool moment as a fan. So now that we've stated the obvious with Oasis, we've kind of gotten over that hurdle, talking about bands and artists that were influenced by the Beatles or reference the Beatles. We're going to dig a little deeper and mention a few other moments in music when the Beatles were referenced that you might not have known about. For my 90s indie rock fans out there, you may be familiar with the 2000 release White Pepper by the band Ween. Ween are kind of known for being an experimental rock group in their own right, although in a very different way from the Beatles. And the album White Pepper was a bit more commercial in sound. It was a bit more radio friendly. You could almost say it was a bit Beatlesque. And that is no mistake. Aaron Freeman, aka Gene Ween, is a huge fan of the Beatles, and it's probably partly why he decided to name the album White Pepper, referencing two Beatles albums, The White Album and Sgt. Pepper. That's just one example, and quite frankly, if I were to sit here and name every single artist that was ever influenced by the Beatles, or every single song that ever included a reference to the Beatles, we would probably be here for a while. So we're gonna really quickly show you a few songs, modern songs, that either reference the Beatles or were directly inspired by the Beatles. And my brother's back at home with his Beatles and his Stones. We never got it out. I hate
like to see him spread eagle. Took a beer to the club.
Now don't look to us. Phony Beatlemania has bitten the dust. London calling, see.
The Beatles actually had their own moment in Hollywood through 5 films that they were involved in during the height of Beatlemania, but their moment on the big screen did not stop there. So everyone knows the famous scene in Ferris Bueller where Ferris jumps onto a float in the middle of a parade in the middle of downtown Chicago and starts lip-syncing Twist and Shout by the Beatles. But what many non-Beatlemaniacs may not have noticed is that John Hughes sort of sprinkled in Beatles references in pretty much all of his films throughout the years. In a similar way to the Beatles being cultural zeitgeist masters of the 1960s, John Hughes sort of took on this role in the 1980s. The majority of his films that are popular were made in the 1980s and have a depiction of life as a young person during this time. Many people now, in a way to understand what life was like in the 1980s, what the culture was like, will look back to John Hughes's films. And he had a huge impact on Hollywood with, young adult drama, young adult comedy, etc. And he was also a ginormous Beatles fan. So of course we mentioned the Twist and Shout scene, but we're gonna do a little countdown and show you some more scenes, some more Beatles references that you might not have actually noticed upon your first or even 30th rewatch of these movies, because some of them are super subtle.
Never had one lesson.
Here, read this. It's really good. Don't leave the... No, you can use my... Hold on.
What is this?
Love is real. Thank you. Really?
What did you want to be when you were young?
When I was a kid, I wanted to be John Lennon.
Who are you? Al Lois.
I quote John Lennon. I don't believe in Beatles. I just believe in me.
How about we run a nice Cadillac? My treat. We can call a limo. Well, shake it up, baby, now. Shake it up, baby. Twist and shout. Twist and shout. Come on, baby.
Moving on from the 1980s into the late 1990s and early 2000s, and we find a show on Cartoon Network. This show centered around 3 sisters, who all each had their own coordinating colors, who were superpowered, had their own unique superpowers, and seemed to be constantly saving their town, Townsville, from the brink of destruction pretty much every single day. Of course, the show that I'm talking about is the Powerpuff Girls. This was a hugely popular show with young people in the late 90s and early 2000s, and continues to be popular to this day. This Cartoon Network original was created by Craig McCracken, who is, again, a huge Beatles fan. In fact, maybe some of you will remember it, but maybe some won't. There was once a Powerpuff Girls episode that was entirely centered around the Beatles. The episode's title was Meet the Beat-Alls, and centered around the 4 villains, the 4 main villains within the show: Mojo Jojo, Princess Buttercup, him, and then the hillbilly bug thing, which name escapes me at the moment. These 4 villains team up to defeat the Powerpuff Girls, feeling that on their own they cannot defeat them, but together they make the perfect team, and they become the Beat-Alls. This episode is like a condensed Beatles history lesson, and even includes an entire monologue spoken by the professor, which is just entirely Beatles lyrics strung into a monologue. Another Beatles reference in the Powerpuff Girls would be through the character Him. Him is a super memorable character for anyone who watched the show in their youth. I remember plenty of people being scared by it, and as we all grew up, we all kind of went, that guy, that was kind of cool. But something that younger audiences may not be aware of is that the character Him was super directly influenced by the character Chief Blue Meanie from the Beatles film Yellow Submarine. McCracken modeled nearly everything from Chief Blue Meanie onto the character Him, including the way that the character's voice sounded, the character's outfits throughout the show. pretty much everything. Moving on to different moments in TV history, and of course we have to talk about all the times that the Beatles were featured on The Simpsons. Now, of course, we did have Paul, George, and Ringo featured in Simpsons episodes where they voiced themselves, and we also had John Lennon featured posthumously as he did pass before the show came on. Now, the episode that Paul McCartney and actually Linda McCartney were involved in were not Beatles-centered storylines, but the episodes involving George Harrison and Ringo Starr were Beatles-centered storylines. And in my opinion, they're some of the best episodes of The Simpsons, but I'm a huge Simpsons and Beatles fan, so that's probably why I think that. And then there are the Ruddles, or should we mention the Monkees first? Oh my gosh, which Beatles spoof TV show do we talk about first? Although the Monkees became a pretty good band in their own right, the television show The Monkees was originally conceived to be this like sort of Beatles spoof. And then, of course, later on, we get the Ruddles, which was a Monty Python sketch that also sort of became its own little thing. This is already a lot of information to sift through. Do we need a tea break? Does anyone need to take a break for tea? All right, tea break. Now, our Gen Z audience may not be super familiar with all the legal battles concerning Apple Corps, owned by the Beatles, and Apple Inc., which was co-founded by tech giant Steve Jobs in the 1970s. So basically, here's the breakdown. Apple Corps had been using the image of an apple on pretty much all of their marketing since day one. And still, if you buy Beatles albums, you're usually going to see a green apple on these albums. So in the 1970s, Apple Incorporated also starts using the brand imagery of an apple and calling themselves Apple Inc., as the Beatles were already Apple Corps. This legal battle lasted decades, even including the Beatles being famously absent from iTunes until 2010. So part of the issue at hand here is that Apple Incorporated says that they are not going to enter the music industry. They can still use the name Apple, they can still have the brand imagery, but they cannot enter into the music industry. And that also means that the Beatles cannot enter into tech. Apple Incorporated tested this many times. They kept pushing buttons, kept nudging things, until finally in 2003, iTunes is released. Apple Corp sued, Apple Inc. won, and today, iTunes doesn't even really hold any weight in the world of streaming, so you could say that the Beatles still won this one, you know, seeing as they continue to hit millions of streams, even to this day. So we've gone over that whole dramatic era for the Beatles. But how else did the Beatles personally influence the world of tech? The Beatles were and still continue to be hugely influential over the world of music technology. Their methods can really be summed up by this quote by Paul McCartney that I'm going to read to you. We would say, try it. Try it just for us. If it sounds crappy, okay, we'll lose it. But it might just sound good. We were always pushing ahead. Louder, further, longer, more, different. So let's go over it quickly, shall we? So let's start off with guitar feedback. Although feedback had been used on records far before the Beatles were the first rock band to intentionally put guitar feedback into a song and to incorporate it into the sound of the song. A great example of this would be on the Beatles song I Feel Fine. I Feel Fine begins with the A string on Paul McCartney's bass being plucked. It is then picked up by John Lennon's guitar, which creates this sort of buzzing sound that rings throughout the beginning of the song. The sound of the feedback swells and acts as an introduction to the song, leading the listener into the tune. And this marks the very first use of intentional feedback on a rock song. Now let's talk about close miking on acoustic instruments. Nowadays, it's really common to place mics uncomfortably close to instruments when recording. I know that I have certainly dealt with this before and it can be a little annoying. But it does help to bring a fuller sound to the recording. And it can also allow for certain instruments such as drums to feel more prominent on a track where they might not have otherwise. In 1966, however, when the Beatles were recording Eleanor Rigby, this was not at all common practice. In order to get a fuller, unique sound, the instruments that were being used in the orchestra for Eleanor Rigby were super closely mic'd. In fact, the Beatles producer George Martin had to instruct all of the musicians on how to play their instruments without accidentally knocking into the mics, because they weren't used to it. The instruments being used on Eleanor Rigby were so closely mic'd that they were nearly touching the strings. But of course, the orchestra on Eleanor Rigby sounds amazing, it sounds lush, it's memorable. And part of the reason is because the Beatles and their producers took a risk and it worked. Now we're going to talk about artificial double tracking, otherwise known as ADT. So this is now commonly referred to as automated double tracking, and it's the process of duplicating an original take onto a separate tape. And the second tape has to have a variable speed control. So the speed control on the second tape means that there's a bit of a delay, which kind of makes it sound like the track has been double tracked without needing the artist to re-record that part. So it makes it a lot easier on the artist. Now, this technique was not really invented by the Beatles themselves, but by Abbey Road engineer Ken Townsend, but it was inspired by John Lennon being tired of recording these parts twice. Especially for vocal parts, it's incredibly difficult to sing something exactly the same twice. So oftentimes, these double-tracked vocals would sound like a little jarring because it was somebody literally doing it twice and not being able to perfectly replicate the way that they sang it the first time. So John Lennon is getting upset about this. He's complaining about how difficult it is to do double tracking with vocals. And Ken Townsend just said, I'm gonna fix that. So finally, we have reached the section of the video where we talk about the part of culture that the Beatles have pretty much no connection to, and that is science. But of course, as we've figured out throughout the rest of this video, even though the Beatles don't directly have anything to really do with science, they super indirectly inspired a lot of things within science. Something that's always been incredible for me to think about is how the ambitions and aspirations of these four guys from Liverpool took them so incredibly far. And I think it's part of the reason why the Beatles legend still exists, why people still care, because I think a lot of times people can see themselves in these four guys who just said, let's do it, and they did. And in some cases, these ambitions and aspirations even took the Beatles all the way into space. So in 1974, a team of paleontologists working in Ethiopia come across a fossil. The skeleton was nearly 40% complete, and it was around 3.2 million years old. And as it turns out, this skeleton, this fossil, was something that once belonged to one of humanity's ancient ancestors. At the time of its discovery, this fossil was actually the most complete and oldest skeleton of an ancient human that had ever been found at the time. And it also lent credibility to the theories that humans started walking on two legs before our brains started getting bigger. So obviously this was a hugely important find for the world of paleontology. At the time of the fossil's discovery and at the camp, they had been blasting the radio, and on repeat, the song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by the Beatles had been playing over and over and over again. And so because of this, the paleontologists decided to name this skeleton of a female ancient human Lucy.
Lucy in the sky with diamonds.
So one of our oldest discovered ancestors is named after a Beatles song. On February 8th, 2008, NASA transmitted an interstellar message to the song Polaris, which is about 431 light years away from Earth. And what was the interstellar message, may you ask? It was the song Across the Universe by the Beatles. This was the first song that was ever intentionally sent out into space. And it was sort of, our way of being like, hey aliens, this is what we have to offer. So there's a chance out there that aliens may have heard the Beatles. Do we think that any aliens out there are actually Beatlemaniacs? Aliens, if there are any of you out there, please tell us in the comments. Now, I was never much of a math or science person in high school, so some of these things while I was researching, I was like, I have no idea what that is, but it's important and it's a Beatles thing, so I included it in this video. The molecular biology of the cell. Molecular biology of the cell. That is something to get out. It is considered the most important textbook on cell biology to exist. It was originally published in 1983, and it was the first textbook to really push cell biology as an integral part of studying biology, and it was hugely influential. In 1994, when they released the third edition, there was something a little bit different about the cover of this book. When this third edition was released in 1993, it featured the 6 authors walking across a very familiar road. This led to a 20-year tradition of the authors of the molecular biology of the cell spoofing Beatles album covers on the cover of this hugely influential scientific textbook. Beatley science? More than 60 years after the Beatles first set foot in New York City and ushered in the onslaught of Beatlemania, we're still talking about them. Young music fans are discovering their music for the first time, older fans are constantly rediscovering them. Young girls are writing letters to Pattie Boyd, the former wife of George Harrison, and telling her about how much they love her personal style from the 1960s. Artists are still using the Beatles' recording studio techniques in their own recording studio sessions so many decades after the Beatles got out of Abbey Road. Disney Plus just premiered the restored version of the 1970 film Let It Be, and people went crazy over it. It was a huge deal. Paul and Ringo are still selling out concerts. In fact, I went to go see Paul a couple years ago, and he still puts on a really good show. Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, once said that in the year 2000, kids would still be listening to the Beatles. I wonder if he realized that in 2024, kids would still be listening to the Beatles. And they still listen to the Beatles with just as much excitement and love and adoration as the first fans did in the early 1960s. And I'm sure that in 2034 and 2044 and 2054 and so on, people will still be fascinated by the Beatles and their music and their lore, their history, everything about them. People will still discover their music and find the magic that was left behind by a group of 4 guys who just turned their dreams into a reality. To quote Philip Seymour Hoffman in the film Pirate Radio, or The Boat That Rocked for my friends over in the UK, there will always be poverty and pain and war and injustice in this world. But there will, thank the Lord, also always be the Beatles. Thanks for watching, you guys. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope that you learned something new. I hope that you walked away feeling, excited to go listen to your favorite Beatles album. I just want to give you one more little bonus thing that I didn't really want to include in the video because it's my own little personal fan theory. And that is that Taylor Swift's new album, The Tortured Poets Department, the title of it is sort of referring to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I don't know. I personally feel like right away as soon as she announced the name for the album, I was like, that kind of sounds like a ripoff of Sgt. Pepper, ripoff in a good way, of course. But yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know if you think that Tortured Poets Department is inspired by Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Tell me if you think that's a stupid theory. Tell me if you agree with that theory. Let me know in the comments. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it. And I hope that you stick around for the next video. Bye-bye.